Hey, folks, welcome back to the Mac and Mike Show. I'm Mac and he's Mike over there. Well, it may be over there depending on how your computer is set up, but I'm Mac. Um, Mike and I usually get together and we get together on the back porch and we have a couple of cold drinks or in my case, cold drinks, in his case, cup of coffee. And Mike has a cigarette. We sit out back and we talk about 1,001 things and we decide what we're going to talk about. Well, this week a little bit different. For various personal reasons, we're doing a Zoom call as our weekly podcast, and that's not a good thing because sometimes we get lost in translation for things that we pick a topic and we kind of bounce it off one another. We know what each other's going to say. So today you're going to get virgin conversation. That is conversation Mike and I have not gone over in any way, shape, or form. But what we're going to talk about today is I was noodling around on the internet and I found an interview with um,
Victor David Hanson.
Victor David Hanson. And he was talking about an interesting subject to me. And I think as he was discussing it with the interviewer, so many different facets of what's going on in our world today became apparent. And what Victor Davis Hanson was talking about was interracial and interethnic marriages. And the statistics that he spouted, and I'm sure Mike will put a link to the original conversation in the text below our podcast. What he said was, what Hanson says is that 50% of Asian Americans are interracial or interethnic marriages. He then said that 40% of Latino marriages are the same, either interracial or interethnic marriages, and somewhere between 15 and 20% of blacks are interracial or interethnic um, marriages. And what he went on to say was, in the world we live in with DEI and woke and all that kind of stuff, what the issue of these interethnic marriages are doing is choosing to report themselves as the race or ethnicity that gives them the most opportunity in the job market, in the best opportunity in our economy. And this, he talked about this from several different perspectives. He mentioned that because of this kind of thing, 280,000 people are leaving the state of California every year. Now, I don't know that the 280,000 are all due just to this, but he linked the two ideas together. He also said that these children of these mixed ethnicity families are claiming the minority ethnicity because that's what gives them the most opportunity and most best chance of getting a job, getting into college, doing all of these various things that they ask you what your ethnicity is. I think there are other ramifications of that. We'll talk about that as we go through, but I don't want to get too far from the introduction without giving Mike an opportunity to chime in on basically the floor, the foundation that I've established. You watched the video, Mike. What did you think?
Well, he made a lot of good points, and I had personal experience with this with my granddaughter. I had to enroll her in school when she came under my care for a year and a half, and I had to put down her race. Now, her mom is white, her dad's black. There was nothing there for mixed. So the tradition is to always go with the black. So I put her down as that after I actually consulted with the secretary there at the school, and she said, yeah, put her down as black. Now, if during certain times of the year, you can look at her in the summer and say, oh, yeah, she looks black. Any other time of the year, you might say, oh, maybe she's Hispanic, because you don't know from the shade of her skin. But the point is, there is coming a time when I think it's not going to be important because people are going to be so mixed that you're not going to know. Like if Brianna marries a Hispanic guy, now she's white, black, Hispanic. She marries an Asian guy, it's white, black, and Asian. So where does she fall in that spectrum? And if she selects, her children selected they're Asian at some point, will that exclude them from getting into higher institutions of learning because there is a bias against bringing Asians into some universities. So, it's very complex. And when I was even young, they said that sooner or later we would basically be one color. I don't think that's going to happen for 1,000 years. It may happen someday, but I think it's going to become less and less prevalent. So that's
I'm not real sure the racial aspect of this combination of issues is what really interests me. I think the facets of the conversation that interest me are, as long as we have the whole DEI kind of world in which we live, um, the people who are most at risk of being discriminated against in some way are the white males. And you can see that in college entrance. You can see that in jobs. You can see that in how we do the DEI training in various corporations that basically, demean white men as racist and misogynist and former slave owners and all that kind of stuff. And I think that you can only discriminate against a group of people for so long. We see that in the Jim Crow South, right? If you had 25%, the rule in Jim Crow South was if you were 25% black, you had to be listed as black, and they discriminated against blacks in the Jim Crow South. So that discrimination of the Jim Crow South, I think, I remember the '60s and and the whole when we went through the whole, the fire hoses and the crossing of the bridges and the protests because they wanted their civil rights, right? So I mean, I saw that on television. I wasn't there. I wasn't in Alabama. I wasn't in some of these, but I saw it on television as a young person, and I remember thinking that's not right. So, but what happens when whites maybe not become the minority, but the whites become the minority of the other combined um, majority? When the Asians and the African Americans and the Latinos and all the other people um, combined become the majority instead of whites in America. Now, how will the whites accept being discriminated against, as is going on today? And I don't know the answer to that, Mike, but I don't think they'll like it, much like the African Americans didn't like it. And much like, as you mentioned, the Asians don't like it when they can't get into the college they want, even though their grades and their scores are better, they're artificially. So I think there has to be some level of equanimity where people are not discriminated against. But how we get there may be difficult. Not only difficult, it may be, you know, it may, I don't want to say bloody because that indicates killing people. I guess what I'm saying is there may be some defiance, and there may be some demonstrations, and there may be some real anger if that doesn't clear up relatively quickly. Here's the other aspect. If you if you are a child of one of these interracial, interethnic relationships, these interracial marriages, what you know, it's one thing when you're white and black, right? Because many people, I know a friend of mine, his son wanted to get into West Point, and he's white and she's Jamaican, and which qualifies her as African American, believe it or not, or black. And so he put his entrance on his entrance form to get into West Point that he was black. And because they have fewer black applicants, that was a way for him to get preferred treatment, preferred entrance into West Point. He did, and he's now graduated. He's a West Point grad. Good for him. But his father told him, he said, "Hey, look, son, do you want to get into West Point, or do you want to go to some other school?" Because his son wanted to fill out white since his father was white. And he said, if you want to get into West Point, it's to your advantage to fill it out as you are a black race. So I don't know how long that can continue, because eventually, not only will there be unhappiness from the white population, but there will be unhappiness with all the different ethnic groups, You can see it right now with the Asians who are fighting the colleges that you mentioned. You know, most of them being Ivy League colleges are giving preference to black students that have inferior grades and inferior accomplishments. Um, and the Asians are not getting into these prestigious schools. And it's all based on a intention of doing right. You know, when they use DEI and when they use numbers to try to bring up the people who have been discriminated against in the past, they're doing it with the best intentions. But the point Victor Davis Hanson is making is how long can this go on before that preference creates problems? Because it's already starting to.
Yeah, well, it's already starting to create problems in the airline industry. I forget, is it American? Is starting to hire, they want 50% of their
Well,
pilots.
Boeing, but the chairman of Boeing come out and said we had the greatest year ever. 50% of our hires were DEI hires. Now it's coincidental, I'm sure, but now doors are falling off of Boeing planes in flight. You know, now it's easy to lay that at the door of DEI hires, and there's no proof of that, obviously. But you understand the go ahead. That's the issue.
Well, yeah, that's anecdotal, but it's every truth usually starts with the investigation of something that is anecdotal. So too many people dismiss that word and say, "Oh, it's all anecdotal. It doesn't mean anything." No, sometimes it does, but you have to look deeper in order to find out if it's true. And of
Right.
course, Boeing had the problem with the rocket, and now they're stranded up on this, you know,
On the
space
space
station,
station.
and
Yeah.
SpaceX has to send a rescue mission in February. I don't want to get sidetracked, but I was talking to you on the phone earlier, and I said my neighbor and I got sidetracked from a discussion of comets to the International Space Station to Elon Musk to politics. So she's a left winger, and it really was kind of distressing for her to hear me defend Elon Musk. But Mason is the only guy that can rescue this, and he's spoken about DEI and how it negatively impacts things, and he certainly hires people based on merit. And I don't know, Mac, if we'll get back to a merit based system. I think that's going to have to be the final conclusion if America is to survive. Now, you pointed out, we're both Christians. Biblically, in the future, there doesn't seem to be an America to come to the rescue in the end times. Whether the audience listens to that and believes it one way or the other, it's an interesting process. I've always clung to that when you said that and said, what is it that could possibly destroy America? And this is one of those many possible things that you bring up.
You know, Mike, if Donald Trump is elected president, I think we will swerve, as a nation, I think we will swerve back towards a meritocracy. If Kamala Harris is elected president, I think that the current state of affairs will continue for the most part in a DEI fashion. Now, that doesn't mean one or the other is right or wrong. I'm just saying that based on the politics of the political parties and based on the capability or strength or what's the word I'm looking for, the personal attitude of each candidate, I think Kamala Harris is much more willing to go along with the ideas and the concepts and the what the Democratic Party platform advocates for. And I think that Donald Trump is much more of a first. I think he is more aligned with the Republican platform, but he also has some ideas of his own. And Donald Trump is an independent thinker, and he's also an independent doer. Okay, um, he says and does things potentially without giving full consideration to all the ramifications. But his instincts are usually pretty good. You know, he's usually on the right side of an issue, and it usually turns out to be a good thing. And how that works out with this particular issue, I if 200,000, if it's a net 200,000 person loss in the state of California every year, eventually the influence of California has got to wane. It has got to be less than it is today. So what goes on in the rest of the world, and I think this is true, Mike. You look at Republicans as associated with red and Democrats being associated with blue. I think there are more people moving to what I'll call the red states than there are to the people moving to blue states. Florida is getting a whole lot more population than the state of New York or the state of California. And it's not because Florida is more beautiful than California and New York, because that simply isn't true. Um, Geography, maybe the weather is more appealing. It's warmer year round, but you don't see the beautiful terrain in Florida that you see in many of these states with rolling hills and rivers and valleys and all that kind of stuff. The change of season, at least in my opinion, there's a lot more physical beauty in many of these other states that people are fleeing than there are in the state of Florida or the state of Texas. Um, you know, Texas, it takes you 5 hours to drive across that state, and most of it is empty and barren and ugly and hot.
Yeah. Well,
So the thing that gets me is if you are in an inner city and you have black skin and you can't get a job and you're oppressed and you're not you're from a broken family. The people on your block who have money and people on your block that have fancy cars and fancy clothes, they're not always the people who are the um, upstanding citizens of the neighborhood. Many of them tend to be criminal and drug dealers and things like that. I know that's a gross oversimplification, and I freely admit all generalizations are false, including the one that I just said. But my point is that a friend of mine that I used to work with many years ago, his cousins, his nephews, lived in um, New York City, and they had a two-block area where their gang was in control. So if you cross the street into another gang's territory, you were beat up or worse. You may not come back from that. And I said to him one time, why don't your nephews just get on a bus and go to a city that doesn't have that kind of violence? He said, Alan, they don't know that. They don't know that that's available. Like your neighbor today that said, "Oh, that's not true. That's not true. That's not." These people don't believe it because it's not their reality. So what happens when these young white men who live in more rural areas? I'm not saying that's universally true. Many of them live in urban environments too. But if they live in rural or suburban areas, what do these newly discriminated against young white men who can't get a job and are unable to find themselves a economic solution to their needs? They may just stay in their parents' basement and live there. I don't know. Maybe that's something, or maybe they look for something, some group to join, some organization to join that will give them some sense of belonging, some sense of future, some sense of what do we talk about all the time? What do people need? Mission, direction, and purpose, right?
meaning, direction, purpose. Yeah.
So if a young white man who can't get a job because he's white, and we're only hiring Asians and blacks and Latinos and any other minority, either that system of DEI hires changes, or these young white men follow the same path that many of the discriminated ethnicities in the past of our history followed. And my point is that these young white men don't have drug dealers to look up to with fancy cars and fancy clothes. So they're probably going to look up to those people who are involved with some sort of militia group or some sort of you know uh, what's this term I'm looking for? The ones that are the alt right or the people that are white nationalists. And I don't think that's healthy for our country. I don't think we want a generation of young white men joining groups that may become problems for our nation in the future. You know, one of the presidents, I don't remember which one, I think it was Abraham Lincoln, said, America will never be defeated from outside. America will only be defeated from the inside. And maybe that happens. Maybe that justifies the lack of America or anything that looks like America in the end times prophecies.
Yeah, maybe. I've often mentioned Tyrus, who is the wrestler. He's often on the Greg Gutfeld show. He's been in a couple movies, and TV shows. But he's half white, half black, and he has often said it's time for white men to start standing up for themselves because I think Tyrus sees this future you and I are talking about coming, and he's just saying stand up for yourself. That's all. Refuse this message that's being pushed that somehow white people are racist, that we're somehow inferior and blind to our own racism. I don't think most white people are blind to their own racism. Um, I think I think some are, but so are blacks. I mean, like I said, my granddaughter, I know all of her father's family, and they'll even admit, yeah, there's a lot of racism among blacks against whites. And, you know, but I grew up in New York City and I was in a mixed neighborhood. We didn't have a lot of blacks, but, we had Greeks and Italians and, we called ourselves, I was a Mick, because I was Irish. We have the Italians were Wops, Dagos were the Hispanic guys. Or no, were Dagos also Italian? I don't know.
Degas were Italian, yeah. We
Spick.
had Spicks, yeah.
That was for Hispanic. And we had Jews and things. So, I just didn't grow up thinking too much about the different races. We had a few black kids come in later, and I was like you, I was aware of the race riots. They've been going on since the 1930s in New York. My grandfather on my dad's side was a New York City beat cop, and he lost his index shooting finger on his right hand in the Harlem riots of 38. And he had to learn to shoot with his left hand. They sewed it back on, but was never able to pull a trigger again.
Right.
So, there's a lot of history there. And I think if we look at history, it does have a tendency to, if not repeat itself, give us an idea of what's coming in the future. So anytime a group is discriminated against, whether it's the Asians in colleges or the whites because they're calling us, white supremacists and blind to our own racism, it's never a good thing.
The other thing that Victor Davis Hanson mentioned is that ethnicities, that is, groups of people who were never considered white before, are now lumped into white. Some of the Europeans who were maybe dark skinned, maybe some of the Egyptians or some of the Spanish, even the Jews. The Jews were never, and I don't discriminate against anybody. Don't hate me, but all of a sudden they're being lumped in with the whites, and I'm not sure that they accept that. Where do the Jews come from? They come from the Middle East, right? So Jews are white, but Palestinians are not. I mean, so there's a lot of misrepresentation that 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 line up with people's bias. Whether it's active or subconscious bias, but there's a lot of this bias going on. And all I know is that in order for people to get along, de Tocqueville, I think, wrote a book about America and how we were a meritocracy. I mean, he didn't use that word, but he said the biggest thing about America is that we all work together as long as my interest and your interest align. And that really, rather than being any kind of racial misogyny going on, it was all green. Will your money help my money? Will my money help your money? Can we make a profit together? That kind of thing, because of our economic system. And I think that we're getting away from that now. And I think we're getting away from it for a lot of external reasons. Inflation is running rampant in this country. I think that every group and class is affected by this inflation. It doesn't matter if you're the African American living in the inner city. Doesn't matter if you're the Latino living in suburbia. It doesn't matter if you're the white person living on a farm. I went to the grocery store the other day and I went to buy, I was making, for my father and myself, I was making chili dogs, right? Realized we didn't have any hot dog buns. Run over to the store, buy one pack of hot dog buns. Now I'm a buyer, not a shopper. When I need something, I go to the store, I look at what's available, I pick something that looks good, and I buy it. But this time, because I was only looking for one item, I pulled these hot dog buns off the shelf. I go to the self checkout. Remember, one item. Wave the barcode under the machine and go to get my credit card out. It said $4.89 or $4.59. And I'm looking at this and I'm holding this bag of buns, which is light as a feather, and there's 8 different pieces of bread in a round form. And I'm saying to myself, $4.59. I remember a package of hot dog buns used to be 79 cents. What happened? When did that change? Now I realize because I'm old, that's probably from the 79 cents is the 1970s price. But honest to goodness, that's ridiculous. And if I notice it, and I'm in an age and stage of life where I don't have to scrimp and save, what about the people that don't have enough money that are better at getting by? How does this inflation affect them? And I think that what that means is, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your racial ethnicity, what we're really talking about is, aren't we all the same in this economy, being affected the same way? And shouldn't there be an understanding, or shouldn't there be a common experience, regardless of skin color, based on the ladder that we're on in the economic scale, right? Doesn't that make sense?
That's what it used to be, Mac. In the old days, it was more of a class differentiation than it was skin color. It was middle America versus the uber rich and the poor, those kind of things. I mean, that still exists. Don't get me wrong. I was thinking of my neighbor, like of my neighbor, you and me. You both have more money than I. I'm not hurting. I'm fine. But you know, things affect me a little bit more than you. And I do stop and think about what about those poor people that it affects even worse. And it's got to be difficult. I just don't know what the answer is, except Trump keeps talking about energy. If we produce enough energy, the price of everything comes down. Everything across
Yes,
the board.
yes, yes,
And that
absolutely.
is the key.
It's all delivered by trucks. The biggest cost of the truck, besides the cost of labor, is the cost of fuel.
Aircraft, ships from across the sea, the energy to produce the food with the the tractors in the fields, the harvesters, uh, everything is based off of energy. So when people say, "Oh, well, if Trump gets elected, we're not going to be that much better off," well, depending on where we get the price of energy down to, it might take a couple of years, but it'll never return to 2020. But maybe not nearly as bad. You can reduce. There have been years of negative inflation. They don't happen very often, but I think they did after Jimmy Carter, who had 14% inflation. And that's sort of like where we are today. What we have 20, 25%. Uh, so there's an opportunity here to return to a semblance of economic sanity. But with prosperity, that's the other thing. With prosperity, it gives us the time to sit around and think about these other stupid issues that don't matter, the DEI things. It's only first world problems. Do you think in China and Africa and all these they're worried about transgenderism? Uh, they only care about, well, is this going to help me today?
Yeah,
Because I need help today.
yeah. If you remember when President Kennedy was elected, in his acceptance speech on Inauguration Day, he said, about tax cuts. And he said, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So that was 1960. You can tell how the Democratic Party and the Republican Party has changed over time. Now, I understand that was 80 years ago. I'm not trying to say, or 60 years ago. I'm not trying to say that but there is a difference. The Democratic Party is talking today about raising taxes, and what Donald Trump is talking about is more tax cuts and raising money through tariffs. And the interesting thing is, he's not talking about putting tariffs on things that we don't make, because we want those things to be as cheap as possible for our consumers to buy. What he is talking about is putting tariffs on things we do make, so that foreign competitors with an advantage in, labor costs and all those other things don't undercut our manufacturers here in the United States. Cars being a perfect example. He's talked about that several times. We don't want foreign manufacturers to be able to use their advantages in forced labor or poorly paid labor to produce vehicles that can undercut our cars, because our union workers are building these cars for us. So all they're looking for is a level of tariffs that will force the price to consumers to be about even. But more importantly than that, it helps our cars. If we're putting a tariff on the stuff that's coming in, we're not being we're not being taken advantage of by this other country who is selling product um, in our country and helping to keep their prices low for their consumers.
Yeah, well, three things that came to my mind is number one, Europe, the EU, has put high tariffs on the Chinese dumping cheap electric vehicles into Europe. They don't want that, and that's the
Right.
EU. The second thing that comes to mind is if tariffs are so bad, this came up in the debate. Why did Joe Biden and Kamala Harris keep the Trump tariffs?
Yeah.
Because they keep saying, "Oh, this is terrible." Well, you kept them. And the third thing is, you're right. Tariffs need to be targeted based on what will benefit America. Now, the other thing about tariffs, what people forget is they say, "Oh, it's going to increase the price of everything." Well, number one, if the jobs come back to America, that's more Americans making more money, which in the long run offsets the higher price.
Right.
Because if you're making it here, you're more prosperous as a nation. So you're right. It's probably a break even, but at least it brings the manufacturing back to America so that we are not dependent on our enemies. And you and I are both military. I remember in the 1990s, there were foreign countries, and probably still is true, making parts for our military aircraft, tanks,
Yep.
equipment that don't like us.
Yes.
If they wanted to shut us down, they could.
Well, the other thing is, like 90% of our prescriptions, the most important prescriptions, the antibiotics, are being manufactured offshore now. So if we're in a war, if we need those antibiotics to save lives, you think our enemies are still going to be sending them to us? I'll digress for just a moment. I know this is not part of Victor Davis Hansen's in our DEI discussion, but the difference between a manufacturing job and any other kind of job in the service industry, in the entertainment industry, whatever, manufacturing takes a certain amount of various materials. They make something that has an exponentially more valuable price, through the labor and through the innovation. And they put together these low cost components, and they come up with whatever it is that they're manufacturing has an exponentially greater value. So when you put together a car, for example, and it costs $8,000 for the material that goes into it, and another $8,000 for the labor that goes into it. So you have $16,000 invested, and you're selling it for $45,000. Okay, so that $45,000 that's coming into that company's coffers is used in a lot of different ways. Obviously, it pays the employees a wage, but it also, because it's creating value, you're actually making money. A service job doesn't make money. They take the cost of whatever service they're providing and the labor that's of the person who's providing it, and it comes out to be, $8 an hour that it costs them in service, and they charge $8.59, per hour, enough to cover all of. So they're making grocery stores make like less than 1% profit margin because they take what's given to them and they sell it and they make a very, very small profit margin. But manufacturing takes a lot of low cost components, adds in the labor, and comes up with a product that's exponentially more value. And that creates value. And that created value is what pays for all these other service jobs and all these other kinds of jobs that go on in our economy. And we've exported most of those manufacturing jobs, so other countries are making more money than we are. It's insane. And that's what Trump wants to use targeted tariffs to avoid and to eliminate the advantages that other countries have. Again, a country like China, they're using Uyghurs to build stuff and they're not paying them anything. They're slaves, right? So they don't have a cost of labor. So I'll get off that because what I really wanted to talk about is this whole DEI thing. This DEI absolutely has a end time in its future. It's either going to end, people forget when we fought the Civil War, it wasn't initially fought over slavery, but eventually it became about slavery when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The reality of it was that as we were moving forward with new technology, think of things like the cotton gin, right? As we were moving forward with technology of the day, eventually slavery would have been ended because it would not have been economically reasonable to continue that lifestyle, to continue that method of farming. So without the Civil War, technology would have ended slavery through its economic benefits. Okay. So what that means to me is that we look at the technology of today and the great advantage that many of these dictatorial, communistic, socialist countries have is their cost of labor being significantly less than ours. But eventually, most of that labor, you saw Elon Musk came out with his $30,000 personally owned robot, right? Walks, talks, watches your kids, makes a drink for you, that kind of stuff. Eventually, all these lower rungs of the job scale will be replaced um, by automation, by robots. You already see that in a lot of the fast food restaurants, right? You no longer go to the window; you go to the little tablet they have hanging on the wall and order your food. And there's lots of different ways that that kind of technology is impacting society. But eventually, most of those lower tier jobs will be done by automation. And that gets into, you mentioned that to me before, the whole idea of should we have a universal basic income, right? Is that where we're headed? And I don't know if that's the answer or not, but do you understand how the DEI hires are going to be an impediment, whether we do universal income, universal basic income, or whether or not we go to technology and these robots replace and these people that are at those lower rungs will have different jobs, maybe in the maintenance of robots. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of there's a lot of issues at the core of what our friend Victor Davis Hanson is talking about. And I just think that you know if it goes on as is without any external impacts, there's going to be division, there's going to be hatred, and there's going to be infighting because you cannot keep people artificially discriminated against. We've seen that with our civil rights movement. You cannot keep people down, artificially held down, and not have some sort of adverse reaction. If, however, other parts of the world around us eliminate some of this DEI stuff, maybe we have a chance to get out from underneath it. But that doesn't change the fact that interracial, interethnic unions are going to produce a class of offspring that are less, attached to a certain definition of who they are.
Yep. All right. Well, our time is up, and we're way under a minute. So any second now, it's going to quit on us.
Mac and Mike
Out.
out.